Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, all right, Reconquista. This is an hour and 17. I think the first part is just, it's like 14-minute long part, something like that. Let's do it. This will fit well because I think this is, you know, Muslims in these, entering the south of Spain, and Goths, Christian Goths I believe Christian, in the north, and so this kind of fits into what I was learning with Belisarius. Kind of happens right after it. Original link to the video, top of the description, all the things, same as always. If you are not ready to learn, there's the door. Home ec is down the hall. You're in the wrong class. Let's go. Ooh, hello. Okay. Caught my attention. What is the Flashpoint history?
When the great empire of the Romans fell in the west, it was the Visigoth who settled in Spain. And
honestly, at first it's like, map is kind of, but I do like it. It shows you the the mountain ranges where you need to, some of the major rivers. It's nice to look at, simple.
When the great empire of the Romans fell in the west, it was the Visigoth who settled in Spain and established a kingdom. They were a race that had been nearly enslaved by the Romans, but they had risen up, grown in power, and rebelled. Along the way to their rise in power, they destroyed Roman armies, killed a Roman emperor, and in the year 410, they sacked Rome, something that hadn't been done, mind you, in 800 years. Now, unlike their predecessors, and quite apart from what later chroniclers would say, Visigoth Spain was not a beacon of sophistication. Under the Romans, the land was watered with aqueducts. And quite apart from what later chroniclers would say, Visigoth Spain was not a beacon of sophistication. Under the Romans, the land was watered with aqueducts, crossed with roads, had cosmopolitan cities, and was the birthplace of impressive emperors. But with the coming of the, quote, Dark Ages, the economy languished into subsistence and barter, infrastructure sat neglected, and the population plummeted.
Guys, how weird this and it's happened a few times. How weird must it have been to grow up in a point in history where you are less, the society is less sophisticated and modern than what came before it. Like that must have happened many, many times in history. We think of these kind of like only in like fictional dystopian movies or novels or whatnot, where World War III will be fought with sticks and stones or whatnot. The idea of history isn't just this upward motion towards progress. It's these big ups and then huge downs, and gradual ups, gradual downs in terms of civilization. And it must have been just so weird to be living in areas without proper, water and sewage and whatnot, and all around you are ruins of exactly the infrastructure that gave you that stuff. And it must have been so weird.
The Visigoth would eventually convert to Christianity and would persecute those not of their faith. But as far as power structure was concerned, they were the only game in town. Yet, even this sense of power was deceiving. By the early 8th century, as the Islamic conquest had come to the neighboring shores of North Africa, the Visigoth were in a dynastic struggle and were essentially emerging from a civil war. It was then that a King Roderick managed to claw his way to the top of the heap. But he wasn't destined to stay at the top for very long. In April of the year 711, a Berber commander named Tariq ibn Ziyad led a force of perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 men into southern Spain. King Roderick, who was busy putting down a rebellion in the north, rushed down to engage him. The king stopped along the way to pick up some reinforcements from his countrymen, and the two armies met at the Battle of Guadalete. Now, on one side of the field, Tarek's men were disciplined and ready for a fight, and on the other side, Roderick's men were disloyal and rebellious. And when
these Muslim this Muslim army has just, learning from the Spread of Islam video, has had plenty of experience over the past few years or decades in fighting.
Roderick's men were disloyal and rebellious. And when the king of the Visigoths rode into that battle, he was betrayed by his own vassals. When the dust settled from the Battle of Guadalete, the last king of the Visigoths was dead, and his army was destroyed. And with that, Visigoth Spain collapsed. Tarek ibn Zayed.
Is this where like the Moors come in? I'm not really sure exactly who they were. I think, weren't they just Muslim North African, native North African who lived in Spain?
Tarek ibn Zayed and his Muslim army was soon to be heavily reinforced by his superior, the governor of Africa, a man named Musa ibn Nusayr, who...
If one of you guys has a better idea of who the Moors are, then let me know.
The governor of Africa, a man named Musa ibn Nusayr, who basically didn't want to be left out on the spoils. And so the two men joined their forces and then led a rapid campaign of conquest. They quickly moved in and took the populated valley of the Beitis River, which they would call in Arabic Al-Wadi el-Kabir, which meant the Great River. Al-Wadi el-Kabir is where the river would later get its Spanish name, the Guadalquivir. And it was along her banks that the cities of Cordoba and Seville were located, which in time, these two cities would become the illustrious capitals of what the Arabs would call their new province, AlAndalus. Professor Catless eloquently describes what the new conquerors thought of this land. Quote, "Aside from the rainy mountainous fringe along the northern Atlantic coast, its geography bore a strong resemblance to the Maghreb, Africa, Egypt, and Syria, a succession of arid plains punctuated by scrubby mountains and crossed by rivers whose waters, if harnessed, could awaken the sun-baked but fertile soil into shimmering, abundant green. Thus the many newcomers, it would have seemed not only familiar, but idyllic, a paradise. Al-Andalus was the furthest point west that the Muslim forces had reached. In the Arab imagination, it was a distant and exotic land, fertile and overflowing with wealth." End quote. By the year 720, nearly all of the Iberian Peninsula was under the control of the Caliphate. In fact, in the eternal quest for more money, the Muslim armies would even go off into France to raid for more plunder. And it was here that they were eventually defeated at the Battle of Poitiers, or Tours, in 732 by Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne. Though in my personal humble opinion, the significance of this battle is just a little overhyped. But back in Hispania, the Muslims reigned supreme. That is, all except for a small sliver of land in the extreme north, which was protected by the Cantabrian mountain range. This last bastion, where the Christians were holding on by their fingernails, would eventually be known as the Kingdom of Astorias. The Kingdom of Astorias takes on an almost mythological presence, at least in the minds of the later Christian chroniclers. To them, she was the heir to the vaunted Visigoths, and it was here where the Christians were holding on by their fingernails, would eventually be known as the Kingdom of Astorias. The Kingdom of Astorias takes on an almost mythological presence, at least in the minds of the later Christian chroniclers. To them, she was the heir to the vaunted Visigoths, and it was here where the birth of the Reconquista was to begin. But it needs to be said that at this point in history, the Reconquista was very little to do with actual conquest and retaking of Muslim land, and much more to do with simply surviving. And this would be essentially its major goal for the next 300 years. O'Callaghan summarizes this really well. Quote, "Indeed, for most of the 9th, 10th, and 11th..."
I'm sorry for for some reason, I just assume that this channel, well, it's not as big as Kings and Generals or Epic History TV, History March, stuff like that. Right? How many subs? Actually, no, it has over 100,000. It's been a great video so far. I don't know why my expectations were low. I don't know why, but I'm an idiot. I'm very much enjoying this, and it's clearing that fog of war. Connecting me, learning about the Byzantines and the fall of the Western Roman Empire and Justinian trying to get it, and then Sassanids and learning about the spread of Islam and how it's all just kind of coming together. Great video.
Its major goal for the next 300 years. O'Callaghan summarizes this really well. Quote, "Indeed, for most of the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, the Christians were at the mercy of the Muslims and could only make weak and ineffectual efforts to oppose their intrusions. The chronicler in the 9th, 10th, and summarizes this really well. Quote, Indeed, for most of the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, scarcely opposed their intrusions. The chroniclers of the 10th and 11th centuries scarcely touch on the theme of reconquest, inasmuch as the Christians had all they could do to survive the overwhelming power of the caliphate. To speak of the expulsion of the Muslims and recovery of Spain in such circumstances, one would have to have great faith in God's promises." End quote. In reality, Astorias was a backwater area, a place that even the Romans had a difficult time with. As such, there was very little infrastructure, no major roads, and few urbanized areas. Ironically...
Wait, so a lot of the things I see in the comments, and I say myself, is that maybe a lot of I was surprised at how much success the Muslim armies were having against established Sassanid and Byzantine armies. And one of the things that I'd agree with is this sort of religious fervor, where you don't care so much about what you're paid or what happens at home or how your family is doing. A way to get that out of the mind and make a better soldier is to make them believe that all of that, this is for God and you're fighting for God. And maybe that provides an extra amount of fierceness when fighting. And maybe the Christians just needed something like that, or the Goths just needed something like that to match them, and the Franks. And so I guess Christianity leading to the Crusades seems to be almost like a response to the spread of Islam. It's like they needed their own religious fervor, Deus Vult, to have the same sort of determination in battle.
Enough, it was this lack of development that may have saved her from the Islamic conquest. Tariq ibn Ziyad and his countrymen, when they came through, found that the Roman roads and the rest of Hispania to be a boon to their expansion. Asturias became a rallying point for the refugees and for guerrilla fighters, those who had fought for the Visigoth and for those who would not succumb to Muslim rule. Amongst these who fled was a Visigoth nobleman. In some accounts, he was even the cousin to the fallen king Roderick. His name was Pelagius, or Paleo, and he managed to organize what was left of the fighting men of Hispania, and was credited with being the first to rise up against the Muslim horde and refuse them their annual tribute. This didn't go over very well, and the forces of AlAndalus decided to pay him a visit in 718 or 722. Dates are not exactly precise, but the latter date appears more often. The Muslim army arrived near the city of Covadonga and demanded Pelagius' surrender, to which Don Paleo was recounted as saying, at least according to chroniclers that recorded this much, much, much later, quote, "I will not associate with the Arabs in friendship, nor will I submit to their authority, for we confide in the mercy of the Lord that from this little hill that you see the salvation of Spain, and the army of the Gothic people will be restored. Hence, we spurn this multitude of pagans and do not fear them." End quote. At which point, after saying this, at least according to the same historians, Paleo rode forth and took on a Muslim army of 187,000 men and defeated them, masterfully using the terrain of the high mountain passes. Not a bad bit of killing for one afternoon, if I can say so myself. The Battle of Covadonga would go on to mark the beginning of the Reconquest and would become a symbol of Christian resistance to Islam, even though the magnitude of this titanic battle might have been a tad bit overhyped. Indeed, it doesn't even show up in the Muslim historical record, even though other major Islamic defeats are pretty well documented. From this point onwards, Astorias would grow and become the precursor Christian kingdom. If there's any really hardcore Tolkien fans in the audience, should become akin to the fabled island kingdom of Numenor, where all the kings of men arose. So it would come to be that for the next 50 years, she would cautiously expand along the Cantabrian mountain range and take over the northwestern portion of Hispania along the Atlantic coast. And by the year 775, under Alfonso I, Asturias would encompass the northern Duero River Valley. While this sounds promising, the land that she took was not exactly prime real estate.
You gotta start somewhere.
The valley that was north of the Duero River was sparsely populated and considered. The valley that was north of the Duero River was sparsely populated and considered at this point in history to be an arid wasteland. It was even referred to as the Desert of the Duero, which would serve as a buffer zone or a no-man's
Okay, it was considered a wasteland due to its lack of population in urban centers.
land, or for the Trekkies in the audience, it was a neutral zone. Harsh wasteland it might have been, but this wouldn't stop the Emirate of Cordoba, now unified under Abdalrahman I, from raiding and attacking. In fact, it really wouldn't be until the latter part of the 8th century that Asturias would really begin to coalesce. Alfonso II would firmly establish her as a kingdom, and in 789 made the city of Oviedo the capital. It was also during the time of Alfonso II that the bones of St. James or Santiago were discovered, and Santiago de Compostela would bloom into significance as a shrine and a pilgrimage route. In fact, this pilgrimage route would explode in popularity and in time would rival pilgrimages that were happening in the Holy Land. What can I tell you? They built a cathedral there and people came. And areas such as Galicia, Leon, and Castile began to get really repopulated.
Brilliant. If there was any strategy to that, hey, let's tell them we found bones here, and if that was the case and they made all that up for that intention, then that's genius. But maybe it,
But this wasn't going to be the last miracle. Professor Catlas gives us the riveting, if perhaps a little sarcastic, account of Asturias' rise in significance. Quote, "It was the year 844, as the story goes, and the army of Abdalrahman II was arrayed on the south bank on the Ebro River at a place called... It was the year 844, as the story goes, and the army of Abdalrahman II was arrayed on the south bank on the Ebro River at a place called Clavijo. This was in a region of northern Spain near Pamplona, which is now known as La Rioja. On the opposite bank, and much fewer in number, stood the ragtag forces of Ramiro, king of Asturias. The cruel Muslim prince, as the legend fancifully claimed, had marched north to punish the Christian king for his refusal to render the annual tribute of 100 virgin girls. Although outnumbered, Ramiro was confident his victory had been presaged in a dream. God was on his side. And as the Muslim host swept into his line, a heavenly figure appeared in the skies. A knight on a white horse who, together with a celestial army, turned the tide of battle and led Ramiro's forces to victory in the massacre of his foe. That figure was none other than St. James the Greater, who would eventually be called Matamoros, the Muslim killer, and would take on the role of the Muslim killer, and would take on the role of patron saint in what would later be referred to as La Reconquista. End quote. Asturias now had land, a capital, a growing population, waterfront real estate, and a patron saint to top it all off. And this wasn't any ordinary saint, but St. James, Matamoros himself. This was a figure that later crusading orders would be named after. Crusading orders that would have mottos like Rubet and Cis Sanguine Are.
Sanguine, is that blood? Sanguinate? Arabum. Rubet and Cis Sanguine. Something blood, something blood, something. Arabum. The blood of Arabs?
Abum, may the sword run red with the blood of the Arab.
I was pretty close there.
Despite the ongoing raids from AlAndalus, things were going pretty well for Astorias up until about the year 910. This was the year that the king, who is now Alfonso III, was forced by his own family at gunpoint, or I should say sword point, to abdicate the throne and divide Astorias into 3 parts. Alfonso III was forced by his own family. Year that the king, who is now Alfonso III, was forced by his own family at gunpoint, or I should say sword point, to abdicate the throne and divide Astorias into 3 parts. Of which, in the year 924, one of the newer states, Leon, managed to conquer the other 2 and establish the Kingdom of Leon. The Reconquista was beginning to warm up.
Okay, so it's split into 3, one of which is Leon that just conquered the rest of the 2. Part 2. All right, we're going to stop here. This has been a really good video, though. Not much else to say. I'm ready for the next part. This clash between the Christian and Muslim worlds. Christianity just kind of, slightly. It is older than Islam, but you got to take into the account it seems like Islam came right out of the gate and became this well-established thing, where Christianity kind of had to hide in the shadows for a bit, and eventually Constantine made it a real thing. Awesome. Clearing that fog of war. See you guys next time.